All right. Well, hello, everybody. We're going to talk about, I know you at this conference has had a lot about testing already. We're going to very specifically focus on reactive forms and specifically testing our forms today. My name is Martine Dowden. I am like Eddie said, I'm an author, international speaker, and GDE MVP, and I just finished writing the last chapter for my next book, Tiny CSS Project. Check it out. It's through Manning. It's out on Meep, the early release version. So do go ahead and check that out. So about testing. So the thing with testing forms is that one, forms are something that we have everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Whether it's in our apps, even our websites, like generally speaking, we end up with the contact form. So there's something that's never going away. And let's face it, how many CRUD apps as developers have we written, right? Everybody at some point ends up writing that app that is nothing but forms. And the thing about forms is that they're incredibly intricate. They have a lot of things going on with them. We've got validation, we've got accessibility, so there's a lot going on, error handling as well. There's so many ways in which a form can go bad. And so they're a very good candidate for, if we're not sure where to start in our unit testing journey, for writing unit tests against them. The reason I picked reactive forms specifically is because it makes for, since it has all of the information related to the form in one place, it makes them a little bit easier to test, in my opinion. Other people might have differencing opinions with that, but I find that having that centralized validation makes it a little bit easier. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Since forms can take up a lot of different ways in which they may or may not be presented, what fields are there, I went with the basic, the basic contact form for this talk, simply because that's something that we see in most applications and most websites. Like at some point or another, as developers, we're going to end up writing a contact form. So that's why I went with this as our example. Um, the when we're thinking about unit testing and whether I'm mentoring other developers or even in my own projects, sometimes I'll be looking at my code and I'm like, okay, what should I test? What are good candidates for testing? What is going to be a high value test versus what's just not worth doing, right? Because I mean, time and deadlines are always a thing, and so we sometimes have to compromise what gets what, right? And so when I'm not sure when to test, I find that one of the great places to go look at is, what are my requirements? Because the requirements give us the where and what the form needs to do. What is the business logic that needs to be there? What are some of the validation aspects that need to be there? Usually our requirements give you that. Now, I don't know about you, but I have been on projects where the requirements were just something along the lines of write a contact form. And so there's not maybe detailed requirements to allow me to go down that road. And so that's a great time to talk to your QA person and see, hey, if you're not sure, what are some things that are maybe common errors? If you've had a bug on the form before, that's a great place to go look at as well. So all of those things kind of give us an idea of where we're going to start. In our case, our contact form is going to have a name field, an email address field, a phone number, and a message text area. And so those each have their own, maximum length they can be, whether they're required, and then it's going to have off the two buttons, send and reset. Basically, in a UI standpoint, this is kind of what it looks like. Pretty standard, pretty usual in terms of our form. Our actual reactive form in that, when we go and create it, we have of course, the name, email, phone, we have the validation, and we have a very nasty regex for our email. And so that's where, for this talk, since I only have 20 minutes, I'm going to hyper focus on that email, because if we look at all of our inputs, right, that's the most difficult one in the bunch. It's required, it's got a max length, and it's got regex. And I don't know about you all, but regex is one of those places where we can really easily get errors. So I figure it's a really good one to start. If I only have a limited amount of time to write my test, that's the one I'm going to pick at, because that's the most likely to have some kind of issue going on with it. So we kind of looking at it, we know that we go ahead and put in our validators. We know it's required, it can't be any longer than 25 characters, and our pattern, obviously, a really fancy regex. So when we go to write our tests, generally speaking, are going to have the it, which is whatever it describing what it's going to be. What I like to do with that is if I have if I have requirements, I'll go ahead and put that kind of it. If it can match to a requirement, I'll go ahead and put that as the use the acceptance criteria for that requirement as my descriptor for that test. That also allows me to know, okay, what pieces have been covered versus not of what was required about that test. Then we kind of set up our scenario. Depending on what we're doing, we may or may not need to detect changes, and then we can go ahead and see and go ahead and check what the expected value is and make sure that it is actually what we expect it to be. So in this case, I'm finding my form through component.form to get my email control. I'm going to patch it null. Basically, I'm checking, hey, does it throw an invalid? So it's not valid, right? I'm expected valid to be false when I pass in a null value. It shouldn't be correct since it's required. It should definitely not be considered valid. I can also take the exact same test and go ahead and check an invalid email address. So if I just type in user, that shouldn't be a valid email address, right? It should have an @ and a dot and all that fun stuff. So that should also be false. And so we can do that with each of our pieces and start passing in values. But at this point, what happens is we end up copying and pasting essentially the same test over and over and over again, right? We have our criteria, our setup, and then what do we expect it to have? So there's a couple ways we can kind of reduce that amount of work that we're doing of just copying the same test over and over and over again, because then maintainability gets a little funky. And because we all know copying and pasting code over and over again long term, what are ways that we can make that a little bit easier to maintain, and so that we don't have to write that much code, right? So what we can do is we can actually take them and go ahead and shove them in the exact same test. So I can actually have more than one expect in the same test, and that way I can start looping through my values and say, okay, I patch, I check, I patch, I check, I patch, I check, I patch, I check, which works out and can start giving us so that we can kind of combine multiple values within the same test. The downside to this technique is that if any of the values inside the test fail, obviously the test is going to fail, but then I have to dig through the logs and the errors to kind of find out, okay, which line failed, to figure out which expect failed, which it works. It means that we don't have to reset up the test every time, but it also means that which means that the test suite can run a little bit faster. The downside is that obviously it runs a little bit, like in terms of figuring out which test succeeded and failed, it can be a little shaky. So let's look at some other options for this. What we can do actually as part of debugging, quick trick, if we put an F in front of our describe or in front of our it, so if we, at the beginning of our test here, we have the it should describe. If we want to run just that one test, if we're trying to figure out what's going on with the singular test, we can put an F in front of it. And so every time, if you have a test suite, especially a particularly large test suite, those tests can take a while to run. And so in order to kind of speed up, and especially if you have randomizing in there as well, because we can randomize the order in which our tests are run. Then if you have multiple failures, you can hyper focus on one test to figure out what's going on, for example. And so by using that fit or that fdescribe, you're going to go ahead and be able to hyper focus on that one test, because the test suite will only run what is in the fdescribe or the fit. The thing with that is don't forget to take them out. Otherwise, if you have some kind of CI/CD where your tests are being run as part of your pipeline, if you do keep those, the fdescribe or an fit inside of your test suite, and you commit that, then that test suite will only run the tests that have the fit in front or the fdescribe, and you're only going to be running a subset of your test suite. So that's not exactly ideal. So what I always do is recommend people put some linting rules regarding that, so that if that should happen, you can get warned, hey, not all your tests are going to be run in some way. So what we can do is, if we look at our structure, we're essentially, when we're testing that our validation is correct, we're finding the control, we're patching a value. We may or may not detect the changes. For reactive form, we don't need to necessarily, and then we check the validity. So since we have a pattern and we've established that's our pattern, what we can end up doing then is building an array. And so, because essentially, if we look at our spec file, right, it's a normal TypeScript file like anything else. So we have the ability to do JavaScripty or TypeScripty things inside of our test. So why not build an array of our values and what the expected output should be, so that we can write the test once and just start feeding it some values and go ahead and get the output. So in this particular example, still focusing on that email validation, right? I have my value, and I'm going to give it, null, undefined, all of those things that should fail. I'm going to give it some invalid values for my email and go ahead and give it some valid values for my email, because we do want to check that, valid values do work eventually. And then I'm going to say whether I expect the validity to be true or false. And then inside the test, then I can just go and do give it my and describe what the test is going to be. Go ahead and find the control, patch to the control, and go ahead and check that validity. Now here you'll notice that inside of the I've gone ahead and put in what the test value is. And that's because you're essentially running the test 10 times or however many times you have inside of your array, which means that if one out of the entire set fails, if we don't put some parameters to distinguish each of the tests being run, now we're going to have an issue where you don't know which one in the array went ahead and failed. So we go ahead and put so in this case, I just put the value because the values are distinct. That's easy to map back to the test. Another option is to go ahead and inside of that object, inside of your array, you can go ahead and put a test name for it. Whatever works for you, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's what's going to work for you and your team to figure out what's what, right? But this allows us to very easily take a particular control, go ahead and patch it a slew of things, and to go ahead and test, which especially in an email field where we have this regex, right, that we had mentioned earlier, where regex can be quite difficult to test and quite difficult to write, we want to come and start throwing some values at it, right, so that we can make sure that it's correctly flagging what's true and what's false. So let's play a little game about what email values are actually legitimate and not. So these are based on the actual specification on what should be considered legitimate on the internet about what an email address should look like. So let's look at the first one. If we take this email address that has a slash in it, do we think that should be a valid email address? Yes or no, according to the specification? Well, surprisingly, the answer is yes. Actually, slash characters are perfectly fine in an email address. If we look at this one where we not only have the slash like before, we have upper and lowercase, and we have a space. So do we think that white space is actually legit in an email address? Well, according to the specification, that's legit too. What about special characters? This one has a percent, has some exclamation marks. Yeah, well, that's legit too. Quotes, why not? We can give it a try. It's a special character. It's a special character, but it's a special character. Those are valid too. And having an equal signs in there is just as valid. So where I'm getting with that is if we go by the actual specification, which is RFC 3696, there's the link if you're ever interested on looking at what are actual technically legal email addresses. That's where that is where you will find where I found these examples. The thing is, that's where you have to start looking at, okay, per the specification set for the internet, yes, email addresses are valid, but that brings in the question of, does that mean our system actually allows that? And obviously not every email provider will go ahead and allow those and those sorts of things. So that brings up a whole new rabbit hole and that's why I'm picking on email addresses, because they are particularly difficult to go ahead and write a good regex against. So once we've established what is it that we're going to consider okay and figured out our actual expressions, we need to get some data to shove in there, right? There are lists out there that are available for sample email addresses, but obviously we also have other fields that we want to test eventually, right? So one of the places that I really like getting my mock data out of is Mockaroo. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, it's just the one I happen to use. And I really like them because I can specify a number of fields, give it what type it's going to be, and it'll spit out. And I can also determine whether or not it can throw null values in there or empty values in there. So I can also test for an absence of data, because in there's a number of products I've worked with where you start looking at the bug logs to kind of figure out, okay, what are our patterns? Is there some training that we need to be had, or is there like some, or just something we need to be aware of, our pattern that as a team we're following that is causing bugs? And one of those that I found recently in one of my teams is the fact that all of our bugs revolved around an absence of data. When data wasn't there, that's where we started seeing bug, or the data wasn't exactly what we expected. And when we're dealing with user entered data, that's something that can happen quite a bit, right? You're getting data that can sometimes not be as clean as we would like it to be. So Makaru is a great place to do that, and it'll export. They have a CSV export and they have a JSON export, which is nice. I usually do that, get the JSON export, and now I have a data set that I can start feeding to my tests for various things, including email addresses. And this is a little small, but you can see some of them that they build out are have multiplayer, have, multiple dots and stuff. So you can get pretty fancy with it. If there's a specific value that you feel that you should be checking for, definitely add those manually as well. So with that, we've kind of looked at, because we start building that array, we can also kind of start hitting our requirements, right? We have this array of values, and we know that we've tested null and undefined. That's cool. You've seen that you have the validity. We can start checking, and obviously for reasons of space on the slide, you would want to check different values. One of the email addresses that are problematic often is there's a pattern in the United States that's for all of our school systems. That's essentially the school / dot where they're at dash school.edu / so there's a bunch of dots in there, and 9 times out of 10 those email addresses systems won't allow those email addresses for whatever reason. The other thing to remember with those is that at the end, a number of systems will still want three characters at the end. So instead of dot, like if you do a dot, instead of .com, it's like .us or like a country code. There's a lot of those now. So you got to be careful about those as well. Anyway, moving on. So once we've built that array, we can also start looking at our character length, right? We know we need a max of 25 characters. So if I do a really, really long email address, right, which is past our 25 characters, we can go ahead and do that. Now, technically speaking, email addresses per the spec can be a lot longer than that. I just don't have the room to put that on the slide. So do go ahead and check what that's going to be for you specifically. And so now we can run that test over and over again. The thing is, we can also kind of extrapolate that one step further. We can even do that for each of our controls, right? So if we have controls that are very similar, so maybe we have, if we have a form that goes ahead and checks for old email, you're changing your email address, right? You have your old email address and now you're putting in a new email address, so maybe you had 2 email fields, then you could definitely loop that inside of Control A and Control B, right? So now you can start building that mechanism of kind of auto-generating your test based on what your requirements are, what you know you're going to need in your data sets. A thing to keep in mind though, and I ran into this early on, I was like, this is super cool. I can start really creating these awesome self-generating tests based on a couple of data bits and a couple of requirement bits, and I can self-generate all of that. And I basically ended up accidentally writing a secondary application in my test suite, because now I have all of this logic to generate my tests. So make sure that you have a nice balance to where you're not spending hours trying to maintain the fact that you have the super fancy system to auto-generate your tests, right? And doesn't accidentally become brittle, because otherwise you're going to end up needing a test suite to test your test suite, and we don't want to get into that game. So kind of balance that out, but know that you've got options in terms of not having to just copy paste, because so much of the unit testing becomes very, very repetitive when it comes to forms, because we're always kind of looking for the same thing. Is the field there? Is it valid? Does it have the proper validation? Does the validation pass? And is it what we expect? So what did we look at in this very, very fast toss? Is one, If you don't know where to start, look at your requirements. And if you don't have requirements, talk to your QA or talk to the person that is, your business person. What does this form need to do? And what are some for sure things this form needs to respect? Are there bits of data that we need later? Absolutely, that should definitely be required, right? What are the pieces? And then look at places where there's likely to be bugs, and regex are a great place to start looking at that. Dates, especially when you consider JavaScript dates, are also a great place to look. Then after that, it's just a matter of building the test, right? All of the tests are going to have an expect. You can get to your component pieces by, look, so I can get to my form by doing component.form. I had named it form in the JavaScript, but it can be anything else. Fixture detect changes in reactive form isn't quite as necessary. We're getting that. You're going, but as soon as you start testing, for example, what we could also do now that we have, once you have all of your validation, you could be checking, hey, is it throwing an error, and showing the user some kind of human readable error on, hey, this field is required or something like that. If you started doing some of that UI work where you're checking for elements inside of the UI being displayed, then you would need to detect changes to get the UI to refresh. And then you can loop over your tests, right? You can write arrays to loop those tests to go ahead and start generating some stuff so that you don't have to copy paste over again. So the code that I presented in the specific tests and the form are actually available on GitHub in my repo. So I'll leave this up for a couple seconds so y'all can see the URL and get that if you're interested. Feel free to do PR it. There's a handful of other things related to testing in that repository. Feel free to, because what I was trying to build with that is kind of a library of some sample tests and sample ideas to start building on. What are ways that we can test various things. So feel free to put pull requests against that if you have ideas or see concepts that you think are missing. And then I also have a blog post that covers what we talked about today. So feel free to check that out as well. It's at andromedagalactic.com blog testing reactive forms. So if you want to kind of see the written version of what I just spewed during this talk, it is right there and available for you. And with that, thank you very much for having me. Much appreciate everybody, and best of luck and on your testing journey.